I'm Greg Ball. I'm the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at the University of Maryland. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this event that is part of the UMDemocracy 2020 series sponsored by the Alumni Association of the University of Maryland College Park. The College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, or BSOS, is one of several participating units which is contributing to this important series. I think all of you will agree with me that this election we're facing next month is like no other in the history of the United States. It's very complicated on many dimensions, and I think it's really important for us to gain information from informed sources so that we can assess the situation and understand it. And today's event concerns a particularly important contributor to our thinking on the election, and that is election polling. This is a challenging activity to engage in. It's the way we assess people changes and all that. And we brought together a terrific panel to talk about this. And I want to turn it over now to our the moderator of the event, CNN political correspondent Sara Murray. Is a graduate of journalism school here in 2007, and we're delighted to welcome her back to the University of Maryland. So I turn it over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Of course. Well, thank you, Dean Ball, for having me, and thank you to everyone who is joining us. Of course, we wish that we were all together in person, but I think it's really important that we're doing this at least virtually for all of the reasons that Dean Ball just laid out, that this is going to be an incredibly bizarre election year. And I think polling is going to sort of give us a better chance to understand where Americans are at right now. And our great panel is going to give us a better idea of how to think about polls and how to interpret polls. So just a little bit about me first. I'm a CNN political correspondent. Last election cycle, I covered Donald Trump's presidential campaign. I went on and covered his White House. I covered the Russia investigation, and now I do enterprise and investigative stories, and right now I'm doing a bunch of stuff about coronavirus with an eye on the politics surrounding all of that. So certainly there's a lot going on in the country right now, and we have this great panel to help us break it down. So I want to start with Chris Antone so he can tell you guys a little bit about himself and his expertise. So Chris, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Antone. I'm on the faculty at the College of Information Studies, or iSchool, and the Joint Program in Survey Methodology, commonly referred to as JPSM. My training is in survey methodology, and my research focuses on modernizing surveys by incorporating new and emerging technology into data collection. So it's a real pleasure to be able to participate in the panel. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Chris Freites, you're up.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. I'm Chris Freites. I am an alum of the Journalism School 2002. I now own the storytelling and strategic communications firm Storyline. Before that, I was a reporter for 20 years, last working with Sarah at CNN as an on-air investigative correspondent. And I also host a weekly political radio show called Politics Inside Out on the Sirius XM network on the POTUS channel every weekend. Hope you'll check it out. And I'm just excited to hear from such awesome experts on polling about how it's used and how you should read it. So thank you for having me.
Yes, if you're not listening to his radio show already, you will be after this. Next up, we have Emily Guskin, who I had the pleasure of attending school with. Emily, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Emily Guskin. I'm a polling analyst at the Washington Post. I graduated from the University of Maryland in 2006 with a degree in government politics in BSOS and communication from RHU with a focus on political rhetoric. So I've really been on the same track. I've been at the Post. This is my second presidential election there, and we have a team of two that does polling. So you've got half the team here.
Okay, well, we're glad to have you. And last but certainly not least, Mike Hanmer, do you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor of government and politics and research director for the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. And my primary focus is on political behavior, public opinion, election administration, and survey research is a core part of what I do to investigate the questions that I'm interested in.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for all of you for joining us. So we're going to do audience Q&A a little bit later, but right now we're just going to get the conversation starting with kind of a broad look about the subject we're talking about today. And that, of course, starts with, what is polling and kind of why are we even here to talk about it? So I think, Mike, if you want to have the first word, we'll just kind of quickly click through the panel and then we'll go on.
Sure. So I think polling is really a great tool to learn what people are thinking. And we really saw a major change in the way we do political science research once polling became much more scientific. And it's a great way for us to explore attitudes, to understand behaviors. And, you know, in some circumstances, I think we can use it for prediction too. But I think for me, one of the key things that we use it for really is to answer theoretical questions that we come up with. And it's a chance to give everybody in society a chance to weigh in and express their views.
Mm-hmm. Emily, what about you? When you think about polling, how would you describe it?
I think Mike hit the nail on the head. It's a way to measure people and what they think in a scientific way, and to see what people as a whole think, or what a population overall thinks, as opposed to just a small group of the people who surround you or those you have interactions with.
Chris Freites, you're coming at it from my neck of the woods. How do you look at it?
I think as a journalist, we look at it as a way to explain the world to people. And that's why it matters that the polling methodology is solid, that the science behind it is correct, because we're trying to draw a narrative out of these polls and really help explain the world, explain why politicians might be doing what they're doing, because that public opinion so often powers those decisions.
Chris A?
Yeah, no, I would echo what others have said. One question that I've been asked before is, how is a poll different from another type of survey? And I think we've already talked about it a little bit, but any survey that focuses on measuring people's opinions on public issues and events, I think is a poll. One critical dimension of polls that I don't think other surveys often have to think about as much is timeliness. Because public opinion is ever changing. And as a result, I think polls tend to have to be designed in a way that allows them to collect data quickly and report on it quickly, whereas sometimes other social surveys can be conducted over a longer period of time with larger samples and so forth. So I think that's one way to think of the distinction.
Yeah, and I think, you know, certainly during these election periods, but all the time we're inundated with, you know, surveys or polls, and they're coming from all these different kinds of places. And Emily and Mike, this one is to you guys, but, you know, when you think about the landscape of polling, who is doing it, and why does that matter for when you are actually looking at and evaluating a poll?
I can take this, or at least start with it. Media outlets like the Post do polling. We also work with universities who do polling on their own, particularly the University of Maryland. We have a partnership with them. And there are other universities who do polling on their own. Research organizations like the Pew Research Center, they do polling as well. And then there's also companies, advocacy groups, political campaigns, and they might have different goals in mind when they do polling than a university or media outlet does.
Yeah, I think Emily covered that very well. And one thing I'll just add from the perspective of research, you know, polling in terms of the cost is still an expensive endeavor, but it's much cheaper than it used to be. And a lot more people can do it now. So you see a lot more people running their own surveys, you know, among the academic community, certainly. We used to just rely on a couple of really large polls like the American National Election Study or research from the Census Bureau, but now people run their own surveys all the time. You know, using various platforms, you know, based on the expense and their goals, but it's something that a lot more people are engaged in as producers now as well.
Right, and it seems like that's an important thing to take into context. You know, if you're looking at a poll that's coming from, for instance, the Washington Post, versus if you're looking at, you know, a poll a political campaign is giving you, because they're the ones who say that they've paid for this data, you might be getting, you know, a different result based on essentially asking the same survey questions. So the next topic, which I'm sure we could talk about all day long, but we won't, is sort of how to look at polls, especially in this election cycle, and whether they are actually the kind of thing that can predict the outcome of an election. So I don't know who wants to start with that. Anyone? Are polls predictive?
I can take that. Polls themselves are snapshots in time, and they don't predict the future. We ask people how they feel about issues when they're answering the questions, and people can change their mind. It seems hard to believe when you think about vote choice that people change their minds, but they do. And then there's also a lot of other things we ask about in survey research, not just who are you voting. If the election were held today, for whom would you vote for? So people change their opinions on issues, and as we learn new things about topics. Those who do make predictions tend to use polling as part of their models, but that's not the only thing that goes into those predictive models. There's other aspects that do it, and polls themselves are not predictive.
Right, so one of the questions that we get a lot, that I know you guys get a lot, is were the polls actually wrong in 2016? Mike A, do you want to start that off? Or sorry, Chris A, do you want to start that off for us? We have one mic.
Sure. Let me first say pollsters are in a tough position because we can always evaluate the performance of polls by comparing poll estimates to actual election results. Most survey researchers are not in this position. But when we do that, we can actually gauge, okay, how well did the polls perform for an election year? There are some infamous examples of polls getting it wrong. So there was the 1936 Literary Digest poll, and then there was the 1948 election where there was a newspaper headline, Dewey defeats Truman, that Truman held up because the polls all expected him to lose when in fact he won. But in 2016, we did not have, the polls were historically pretty accurate, actually. So the American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, looked into this, and they took the average of all the polls conducted within 13 days of the election, and then compared it to what actually happened. And they found that the polls missed the final vote margin by about 2 percentage points. This is pretty accurate. That's on par with what polls have been doing over the last 6 or 7 election cycles. So they tended to overestimate Hillary Clinton's support by that much. The state polls, by contrast, were not very accurate. They tended to miss the vote margin by about 5 percentage points. So that was definitely a limitation in the last election.
And certainly 5 percentage points, you know, it turns out in the last election cycle is a pretty big deal. I mean, Chris, what do you think about when people ask you, you know, Chris Freitz, were the polls wrong in 2016, and sort of how can we think about that going into 2020?
Yeah, no, I think there is a bit of a misconception that the polls were wrong because the polls had Hillary Clinton ahead for so long. And I remember reporting on these polls on CNN right up to Election Day. And in fact, we started to see even in those swing states that the polls did tighten in those last 3 or 4 days. Now, that wasn't the prevailing narrative for the months beforehand. So it's easy to understand why people maybe didn't get that polls were tightening in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan up until Election Day. And so that's something to remember. But the other thing that when we looked at the polls after 2016, because there was a lot of soul searching, as you know, Sarah, about well, what went wrong, like why were we not on the beat here? And there were a couple things that stood out. One, you saw that Undecideds broke a little bit more heavily for Donald Trump. And so that's not something a poll can predict. If you're undecided up until Election Day and then you go into the booth and you pull the lever, well, that's voting. That's why every politician likes to say the only poll that matters is Election Day. Then if you look at Trump had higher turnout than expected. And so that was also something that you couldn't necessarily poll against, particularly when you're looking at likely voters. If other people came out who weren't necessarily likely voters, you didn't have them in that data set. And finally, and this is where the polls tended to get it wrong, and this was largely in the state polls, was the weighting by education. And the differences in education, whether a voter had a high school diploma or a college degree, didn't tend to make a huge difference in past elections. It turned out that it made an enormous difference in 2016. People who had a college degree supported Hillary Clinton by a wide margin, and in fact, people who have a college degree are way more likely to take a poll. So they didn't weight the education in those state polls, and that was one thing that the pollsters found that they could have done better, and you're seeing some of that adjustment here in 2020.
Emily, what would you add to that, and you know, sort of how we should think about this as we go into 2020 as well?
You probably saw me nodding a lot because what everyone said was spot on. I do want to say that the average polls in the 2016 report that APOR put together that Chris A. mentioned showed she had about a 3 percentage point margin lead, and it was a 2 percentage point win in the electoral in the popular vote. So within a point. The weighting by education is such a huge thing, and to explain that a little bit more, in a lot of these Midwestern states, there was more people who answered the surveys were college educated, as Chris F. mentioned, and that didn't reflect the population in the state, where not as many people in those states have college degrees. So a way to control for that is, we call it weighting, and that means that you adjust the percentages based on the population in that state. And we've got the data because Census, which is a much larger poll, understands the share of people in each state who have things like college education. So it gives pollsters like me tools with which to reflect the population better. But everyone else, everything they said is right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, as you guys pointed out during this, that we are looking at, and important to remember this time around, we're looking at snapshots in time. Things still change. Voters are still undecided. People can, feel one way today and feel a different way 6 weeks from now. And you do have to kind of look at the way that these numbers are moving, and not just, the way that they look on a given day, and think that that's going to be predictive of an election result. Now, you guys have talked a lot about sort of the differences that we saw in national and in state polling last time around. And Mike, I was hoping that you could kind of break down for us a little bit more about, why it is important to look at both the overall national polls and also these state-by-state numbers.
Sure. So from my perspective as an academic researcher, I really start from, what is the question that you're trying to answer, and then what's the population that you're interested in. So I tend to be interested mostly in national samples, unless we're investigating, certain policies that might be up for debate in the state. So we do a lot of polling with the Washington Post on the state of Maryland, because we're interested in what are people's attitudes about the purple line, for example, or other sorts of policies. But when it comes to the election, we know that we're really running 51 separate elections. The 50 states in DC and are in the Electoral College, and we have to think about what's going on in these places. And it's difficult. You have to know something, I think, about the particular states to do a really good job of polling in those places, how to do the weights. Another thing, the only thing I would add to the previous discussion, which was really outstanding, is we don't have a good handle on predicting turnout. That's a real problem for political science, and I'm trained as a political scientist, so I take some of that blame. But the Washington Post uses one approach. New York Times, I'm sure, uses a different one. The American National Election Studies uses a different one. There isn't a single go-to, here's how you predict likely voters. And that's really even much harder when you get into the state level polling.
Do you want to give us your pitch on why we should even care about these national numbers if we do decide our elections based on electoral college system?
Sure, well, because I think there's so much more we can also get from these in terms of the way people are thinking about attitudes. And then also, again, from my perspective as someone who's helping students question what we do and why, if there's a major difference in the national popular vote and the electoral college vote, that should make us think. We should think about whether that's the right way to do things or not. So I see tremendous value, not just in terms of getting a national sense for how people are thinking across the country, but in comparing that national result to the electoral college result, and really investigating whether some of our institutions are doing what we want them to do now, and how they were comparing that to how they were designed. And the world's very different than it was at the founding, and we should think about those questions from my perspective.
Yeah, I think in the context of elections, of course, also we pay a lot of attention to kind of the horse race, whether we're looking at national polls or whether we're looking at state polls. And I'm just curious, and this is open to anyone who wants to take it on the panel, what else you guys are looking for when you're like breaking down these polls, whether they're coming from media outlets and elsewhere. I mean, what else do you find a value in them? You know, what other kinds of questions or trend lines are you paying attention to that you think really tell us something about the country? And, you know, if you want to address that in the context of the world we're living in now, go for it.
I would just say, as a reporter, Sarah, as you're looking at these polls, while of course all the elections are kind of 51 state elections, and that's how you put together the votes you need for the Electoral College as a candidate, what you're talking about and how you're talking about it is a national conversation. So trying to understand, okay, well, where does COVID and the federal government's response fall compared to Black Lives Matter and social justice and job loss and the economy? How do all these things fit together? And I think when you look at polls, and as you particularly get into those crosstabs and you start to see that, well, you know what, voters who are critical of the federal government's COVID response also care a lot about the unemployment rate. Well, then does that tell you that people who have lost their jobs are maybe very critical of how the federal government has responded? What does that mean for our election? You can start making calls. You can start finding stories. You can start trying to flesh out what that broader data is telling us by going and talking to some of those poll respondents and getting those stories. So I think the national conversation is always driven by those big national polls, even though when you're trying to keep score, you kind of have a national conversation with the national polls, but a scorecard with those state polls. So that's maybe how I would think about them. What are we talking about? Well, that's driven largely by the national polls. Who's going to win and who's leading in that Electoral College? Look to your state polls.
What else are you guys looking for beyond the horse race? And Emily, Mike, Chris, any of you guys want to weigh in? Other Chris?
One of the things that we've looked at a lot is a question that we keep asking about how worried you are that someone in your family or household is going to catch the coronavirus. And we use that as a crosstab, like Chris F. mentioned, to look at vote choice and other issues. We're living in a pandemic, and that is affecting how a lot of people are thinking and feeling about things. And I think it also makes a big impact nationally when you see images of, for instance, people who are protesting wearing masks. And it seems like a lot of people, and you shake your head if you are a mask wearer, that is happening. But when we have a national poll and we ask people, do you wear a mask when you leave the house? And a majority of Americans say that they do. That puts it in a context that we can understand nationally, as opposed to just an image of a protester not wearing a mask. So we can understand what most Americans are doing. People who are wearing masks are probably also staying home more, so you're not going to see them out doing things as readily as you would seeing a group of protesters.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would add from my perspective is for the stories that I work on now in the context of coronavirus and the political response. I mean, I've been paying close attention to the percentage of Americans who say that they're going to get a vaccine once that is available, and how that number has moved and what that can potentially tell us about our faith in government right now. You know, I also think for anyone who has reported on elections before, you know how important people's own economic situation is for them. So when you look at kind of where Americans are and who they trust more on the economy, or how they feel about their own personal economic situation, you know, in some ways and in some moments that can tell you kind of more about what way they may be leaning, you know, than just the horse race numbers. Is there anyone else who wants to add in things we should pay attention to in these polls beyond the horse race before we move on?
And we're just talking about electoral and political polls. There's so many other things we get to ask about, usually in odd years, not in even ones, but we've done really fun polling about behaviors towards sports and what people think about that. And Mike mentioned a few polls we've done in Maryland about opinions there, but there's so many tools you can use for polling beyond just the horse race. And I think it's a lot of fun to do non-political stuff as well.
Polling is super fun, and but you have to understand what you're working with. And Chris A., I want to come to you to give us a better sense of, you know, what people need to think about and pay attention to when it comes to polling methodology, why that matters. You know, we talked a little bit about weighting earlier, and I think that's, you know, it's kind of a confusing concept if you just look at the overall number for people to wonder who are you talking to? How are you contacting these people? How do you come up with these samples? So wherever you want to start, Chris. A.
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned APOR earlier, Professional Organization for Public Opinion Researchers, and they have launched something called the Transparency Initiative, where they ask pollsters to basically report a whole bunch of methodological details about their polls. There's a checklist on the APOR website that they provide. And as a consumer of polls, it might be good to look into some of those details. The one big one is the response rate. You know, response rates aren't perfectly correlated with error, but you know, other things being equal, a survey with a lower response rates tends to be less accurate. So that's a good place to start. I mean, picking up on what Mike said, I think the population of interest is very important. So some people who don't follow polls closely might not know that some polls make inference to the general population, some focus on registered voters, and then usually late in the election, pollsters start focusing on likely voters. And it seems like those polls tend to be the most accurate, but that's also something you can figure out by reading the details of the poll. And then you mentioned weighting. I mean, that's a big one. So in the 2016 election, the Nate Cohn at the New York Times gave the same data set. So this is a data set with identical rows of respondents to several different pollsters, and then asked them to apply their weighting procedures, which are just statistical adjustments that they make to try to make the sample, the distribution of, you know, characteristics of the sample similar to the population of interest to them. And you can do this in lots of different ways. Anyway, all 5 pollsters ended up with sort of different answers, even starting with the same data set. So obviously there are decisions that have to be made before you even collect the data, but that's just the post-survey processing side. And then I guess the final thing I'd say is timing is a big one. I mean, you can always figure out, you can look at when polls are conducted. I think Chris mentioned this earlier, that there are late deciders in elections. Sometimes they break evenly for each candidate, sometimes they don't. So other things being equal, the polls are conducted close to election might be a little bit more trustworthy. Of course, this election is a little different with many people voting early, but I think that's a general rule of thumb. Yep.
What should people keep in mind when they're looking at how a poll is conducted, whether you're contacting people by phone, on a landline, on a cell phone, or a poll that they might fill out online, and how do you need to think about that in terms of like the reliability of the result?
I can take this if you want. There are lots of different ways you can poll. We do polls mostly by telephone. We also do some online ones, which I'll get to. And the majority of our telephone polls talk to people on cell phones. There's an increasing share of Americans who are cell phone only households. I am one of them, and you can't reach them by a landline. So if you look at the methods that Chris A. mentioned, they should say how they reached people, and if it was landline only, you're missing some people. But you're also gonna miss some people when you do online only polling. There are things called probability-based panels, and those randomly sample Americans to then take online polls. And many of them will get people who didn't otherwise have internet access to the internet, so they can answer these polls, so that they are still not dealing with the chance that they would miss a different opinion that someone could have because they don't have internet access. And they actually reach those people initially to join those panels by telephone or sending them a letter so that they can access a random share of people throughout the country if it's a national probability-based panel. There's also non-probability panels. They're also called opt-in panels. You'll probably see like online someone says, oh, answer this poll. And that means that they're not random samples, that anyone can answer them, so that it's not a representative population of the United States. There's a few other ways to sample, but There's also automated polls, which are called IVR, or interactive voice response polls. And those are ones you get on your phone. Usually they're only landline because it's illegal to call cell phones with them. And you answer by either pressing a button or saying out loud, like you're talking to a customer service recording, your responses. So those polls will generally be landline only. And based on what we know about the population of the US, internet access, cell phone only households, you can make good judgments on whether or not these polls are representative or not.
Right. Perhaps the opt-in poll is not going to be your most reliable poll.
But some have proven themselves by doing election polling close to the election and showing pretty close results to what they have. I think the Pew Research Center did a really big report a few years ago where they looked at a bunch of different opt-in polls and they anonymized them and compared to see which were good and bad. And then of course, a bunch of people figured out which polls they were talking about. So there are lots of different ways of polling. Chris's research is showing us that there are new ways of doing this, and we're still gonna poll no matter what. And we wanna know what Americans are thinking, and we wanna reach them where they are.
Okay, so we need to talk for a second about the margin of error on polling, because I think a lot of people's eyes just kind of glaze over and they don't bother to like read that part. And then they're like, wait, but in 2016, the polls showed Hillary Clinton was ahead, and like I didn't bother to read any of the fine print on any of those about what a margin of error is. So if someone wants to take just a quick and dirty explanation, what is the margin of error? Why should you not just like eyes glaze over, skim over that part of the poll?
I could do that. So this just provides the range that the answer, the population true value, likely falls between if you had collected data from everyone in the population and not just a sample of the population. So the larger the sample size, the smaller the margin of error, other things being equal. So a typical margin of error for a poll might be plus or minus 3 percentage points. This just means that if you were to conduct that same survey repeatedly, most of the time, 95 out of 100 of those surveys, you would actually be able to, you would have a margin of error that covers the true value. One thing that's confusing that I'll add is that oftentimes I think journalists and just other consumers of polls are interested in which candidate's ahead. And for that, you would need a margin of error of the difference between two candidates, which is not reported. As a general rule of thumb, this is about twice as large as the margin of error for a single candidate. So in this case, in the example I just gave, it would be plus or minus 6 percentage points. So you would need, candidate A would need to have a lead that's 6 points or larger over candidate B before you could before you could claim that that's a reliable difference and not something that could just be due to random chance. Yep.
Well, you know, like Chris and Emily, if you want to talk a little bit, how do you guys, you know, Emily, how do you help the Washington Post reflect that? Chris, how do you try to reflect that kind of thing when you're reporting on it?
We, AP Style Guide actually came out, I think 2 years ago, with some good guidance on how to write about things that are small leads or edges, which is a really good tool for reporters to use so that they're not overestimating a lead that one candidate has over another. A good rule in Chris A's double rule is a really good one to keep in mind, but also no one is ever leading by a point. There should never be a headline that says blank is leading by 1 percentage point, because those are fundamentally the same shares of the population, and you can say that they're roughly tied. So there are tricks in language that you can use, and I think the AP's guide is pretty good. Also, a good thing to remember is that when you look at subsamples and there's smaller groups of people, say where you're looking just at women, the difference has to be even larger because their sample size is smaller. And as the sample size is smaller, the margin of error grows. So you need to see a larger difference in the numbers in order for there to be a statistical difference in the share of voters supporting one candidate or another, or like changing opinion over time. Again, not just the horse race.
Right. So Chris, how do you think about this when you're reporting on polls, and you know, how do you like convince people they should still, even though there are these margins of errors to pay attention to, even though there are these caveats, even though no candidate is ever leading by a point, you know, why should you still be paying attention to these shifts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think part of that is just good reporting, right? Like part of reporting is just telling viewers and readers what we don't know. and what the range of options are. And going to Jenna Gist at CNN or Emily at Washington Post and say, hey, do I have this right? Like, am I looking at this right? And here's how I described it. But there are a lot of tricks, and you get very good at this as a reporter, of how to not write around, but to make sure you're generalizing and that you're not drawing too sharp of a conclusion from a poll. Because again, I think we can't say this enough. It's a snapshot in time. That time has already passed by the time you have the poll, and it's not predictive of the future. So showing and telling all of your audiences, this is what we know from this. This is what we can gather, and here's what we can't gather, I think is the most honest and fair way to talk about it. Now, it gets shorthanded a lot in our profession, and I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we do, and the pros who look at polls every day, and I'm thinking of you and David Chalian and Mark Preston at CNN, for instance, that often comes through when you're talking about it. But there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of things to say around these polls, particularly on television. It's just always important to make sure that you, one, read the fine print, and two, explain it to your audience.
Yeah, when I think back to 2016, and as you guys pointed out, we started to see this kind of tightening. It wasn't just a matter of kind of looking at the polls. It was also a matter of, what sources do we know in these states, and then calling them and checking in with them. And to be honest, in a lot of my conversations that time around, they were saying Donald Trump would have to run the table. It's too close in too many states. There's no way he can eke it out in enough of these states. And these are Republicans saying this. At the last minute, all these undecided voters would have to break his way. And, it turns out Donald Trump was able to eke it out in all of these states, and undecided voters did break his way. So I think it is important to remember that this is a snapshot of time. There's a lot that we don't know until people do show up on election day. And I just want to talk a little bit about this election day, because this is obviously going to be very different. We're going to have a lot of early voting, a lot of mail-in voting. We have a global pandemic raging right now. So I guess, Mike, I just kind of want to start with you about sort of what are the challenges this time around polling, and particularly around the idea of who is a likely voter in this kind of environment.
Sure. So right now, if you're a media organization or an academic in the field, you have to ask if you've already voted. It's not just, are you going to vote? Because some people have already voted. Do you have your ballot? Have you applied for your ballot? You have to ask a lot more questions than you normally would, and have to figure out how to do that in a way that helps you understand what's really going on and doesn't interrupt too much the flow of your survey. But that's a real challenge now to figure out when to ask those sorts of questions in the survey, and making sure that we track that. And certainly for I don't know how the media organizations are thinking about exit polls this time around, but that's a really big challenge always, particularly now, because we're going to see a lot less election day polling. And again, it's going to vary by state, which again then complicates things if you're trying to understand what the actual outcome is going to be. And another thing, referencing back to some of the earlier questions about state polls and what else we can learning about how people are going to cast their ballots is crucial for understanding when we can expect reasonable results at the state level, and certainly for understanding differences between Republicans and Democrats, because there are real differences in terms of their preference for in-person voting and absentee and voting this time around.
Mm-hmm. Chris A., is there anything that you would add to that, just in terms of how we need to think about likely voters and just sort of what it is going to be like for people to vote during this kind of time?
I mean, one thing to be on the lookout for is the rise of non-probability polls. So I think that's an interesting development in the polling world. More and more polls are now, not selecting a random sample. They're relying on convenience samples of people who opt in. So I think that's, as a consumer of polls, I think it's wise to look at how the sample is selected. For these polls. This is a relatively new phenomenon. It's started in the past, I'd say 10 years. But yeah, I think that's the biggest change that's sort of affecting the polling world. And to be honest, I don't think we have a really solid sense in the field yet of how accurate these polls are.
Yeah. Emily, Freites, is there anything you guys want to add just about what we need to think about it in this particular climate that we're in right now?
I think people touched it really well. I think one thing we looked at in 2016, everyone talks about the shy Trump voter, and that people who supported Trump weren't willing to tell live interviewers that they supported his candidacy. The APOR report that Chris mentioned looked into that and found very little evidence that existed. They compared live interviews to people who did online surveys where they might be more comfortable sharing an opinion. So that's something that people bring up a lot when I'm at, when I talk to my parents' friends, which I haven't done in a while because pandemic, and people ask about that a lot. Other things people ask about is people not being truthful in surveys, and we don't see a lot of evidence of that either, but I think APOR just came out with a new report on that. We also have, I'll do a plug for APOR right now, that there are a lot of tools on their website that people who have questions about polling can turn to. There's a section on apor.org, AAPOR, that it says for media, but there are resources there that I think anyone would be interested in reading. There's a cheat sheet on polling in there that gives you a one-pager on everything that you can ask questions about when you look at polls, when you look at those methodology statements, to understand what you're looking at and to let you know, to let you be a good judge of whether or not you should trust the data you're looking at.
We love it.
One thing I would say, Sarah, about why 2020 is not 2016, there's a lot of reasons, and frankly, when I talk to my Democratic sources, a lot of them are very gun-shy to celebrate the lead that Biden's had. But Biden has had a rather stable lead. If you look back at what Hillary Clinton did, her lead bounced around a lot, and there was not nearly as much stable polling over the last 6 or 7 months. Joe Biden has been ahead of Donald Trump by kind of high single digits to low double digits for most of this race. The other things that are different in 2020 than 2016 is Trump has a pretty stable ceiling of about 46%. He hasn't been able to get above that ceiling in hundreds of surveys. He's hit 47 a few times, but that's something that he has not been able to bring more voters into his camp. So that's a data point to take into consideration as well. A couple other things I look at: the third-party voting that happened in 2016, it was 6%. That was the highest since 1996. That's going to be much lower this time, and that means that the polling we're seeing is much more of a choice between the two major candidates. The third thing is Biden just more likable than Hillary Clinton, and that is something that I think gets lost. It's generally in the crosstabs and further down in the data in a lot of these polls, but she had a 56% negative rating. Joe Biden has a 46% negative rating, and if you look at people who think of them very negatively, Hillary Clinton's at 43, Joe Biden's at 33. And so when you kind of consider these polls and the differences in the dynamics, because the polls are always contextual. And so what's different this race, this cycle in 2020 are those three things. And looking at those, I think Democrats have a little bit more confidence that while certainly anything can change, certainly as we saw those polls can tighten, there is more confidence that Joe Biden actually is ahead in this race at this particular point in time than they could say for Hillary Clinton last time.
It's also kind of amazing to see a stable lead in a world where we're just like drinking out of a fire hose of news every day, but here we are. Okay, well, some of you folks have already figured this out, but there is a way that you can submit your questions. If you're participating, there's a Q&A button in the bottom right of your Zoom box. So if you have questions for anyone on the panel, you can type it in there, you can submit it, and we are gonna start cranking through your questions, so it's not just me who gets to quiz everyone. So our first question is from Kyra, and she wants to know, can you please explain the percentage point system? Also, do we give too much weight to undecided voters, and do we essentially inflate their importance? So anyone want to take that one?
I would just say on the undecided, I will let one of our polling experts talk about the percentages. I I'm a journalist. I don't do numbers very well. But I would say on undecided voters,
hard on
when you
yourself.
look at those numbers, they are so small this cycle. There aren't that many undecided voters out there. So I think the question is a good one, which is, I don't think they're going to have as much weight, those undecideds, whether they break one way or the other. They're in the very low single digits. I think what you should be watching are the soft voters in each camp. So who Biden's soft support, Donald Trump's soft support, are they going to come out and vote for that candidate? Are they going to be persuaded by the other candidate that because they only had soft support for Joe Biden, can Donald Trump steal that voter and motivate them to vote for Donald Trump, and vice versa for Joe Biden? So as I look at these polling numbers, there's a bigger universe of that soft support. One, do they come out to vote? And two, do they come out for the candidate who they had that soft support from? Or are they up to be persuaded by the opponent? I'm watching those dynamics much more closely than I am the undecided voters.
Emily, did you have something you wanted to add on that?
Really quickly, everything Chris said is right too, but we don't weight anything more by undecided voters. We want to know who is an undecided voter, but usually we don't even have enough to break them out and look at them in particularly. I think reporters tend to want to interview undecided voters because that's an interesting way to look at a race and see what people who are truly unsure what they're going to do, what they're thinking, why they're thinking that, what their experiences are. And one way to find those voters, especially during a pandemic when we can't comfortably go out and easily speak to undecided voters, is to use callbacks from surveys and identify those people. And my colleagues in the newsroom can reach out to them safely via telephone.
Yes, we do very much appreciate that part. Especially in the middle of a global pandemic.
Indeed.
More challenging. So we touched on this a little bit, but I think it is worth revisiting. This is a question about exit polls and how they're used on election night. And also this person wants to know how they could be different this year when so many have voted ahead of time. So Mike, I know you talked about that a little bit earlier. I don't know if there's more you want to add just about maybe sort of how those could be contextualized this time around.
Sure. So, one of the things that I think, the journalists on the panel can speak more to this, but my understanding is, exit polls are an important part, but they're not the only part to making the call, on election night. When you see these decision desks, the exit polling is going to give a lot of information about what's happening on the ground, but that's just one piece of information. There's also, a really close look at previous election results, whatever information is coming through on the actual election results as they're being reported by the jurisdictions in a particular place. But they're an important part of that, but it's really hard to do. This time around, again, I think it's just going to be much more difficult because so much of the population is going to be voting by mail that, to the extent that exit polls are going to be just in person at precincts, and that's going to cause problems for their ability to provide information.
Well, and Chris, Freites, I suspect that you're in a similar boat that we're in at CNN, which is, anticipating that we may not know on election night.
Yeah, and to piggyback on something that Mike said earlier, which was there's clear preferences between voters and their partisan breakdown. Those who prefer to vote mail-in versus those who are more likely to go to the polls. Traditionally, we've seen Democrats more likely to mail in and Republicans more wanting to go to the polls. There's been some messaging from both parties that is changing those numbers. But to Mike's point, if you're only asking people who are at the polls, you may end up skewing your results because we already know that one party may be more likely to show up at the polls than others. To your point about the chaos that could come, this so-called red mirage where you could see, because Republicans are more likely to go to the polls, that they could be winning on election day because the mail-in ballots have not been counted. There's reasons for that. Some states, you can't even open a mail-in ballot before election day. Other states, you can open them and start to process them, but you can't count them. And remember, I think it's so important to remind people that these are not just state level elections, these are local elections. So when the CNN decision desk is trying to figure out, can we call Ohio, they're on the phone with the Cuyahoga County Clerk's office, trying to understand how many votes came in, how many are left to count, and where are we? That's how granular it gets. And so this idea that we might not know, I think it's so important, Sarah, to remind everybody that's okay. It is not a fraud. It is not a hoax, that the votes need to be counted. And just because we don't have a result as we normally do on election night, that's because generally most people vote in person, and the amount of outstanding ballots that are absentee or mail-in, and that includes those who are voting overseas, are men and women in uniform, there's not enough of those ballots left to decide the race. So for instance, if there are 1 million ballots cast and there's only 30,000 that are left to count, and there's a difference of more than 30,000, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how those votes count. But I think this time you're seeing a little bit of a difference there.
Well, I like the essay for election integrity. That was a good one. The other one, we haven't really gotten into, but I know a lot goes into how we word the questions that go into polling. And one of the questions we're getting, is there a way to identify bias from the way that a poll is worded? And I don't know if Chris A, maybe you want to take that one, or Emily, or anyone.
I can take it, I think, and Chris can chime in afterward. Most of us can read a poll question, and I think the Transparency Initiative asks that pollsters release their survey questionnaires so that you can see the full questions in the order in which they were asked. And one way that you can, I think most Americans can read a question and see that we try to ask it as fairly as possible, because if we ask it unfairly, then our results aren't very useful. Also, the order in which questions are asked is really important, because if you ask a question about a certain topic, and then let's say you ask, do you wear your mask when you leave the house every time or not? And then in the next question you say, well, what's the most important issue to you in voting this election year? People might have the tendency to say the coronavirus because they were just primed to think about the coronavirus in the last question. So not just question wording, but question order is also really important.
Yeah, I would add that I think the question that's often used in polls to determine vote preference is something like, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? I think that question's been carefully evaluated. I think it's asked, the same wording is used by most polling organizations. And as Emily said, this is often reported in the methodological details. But that's not to say that there can't be bias that creeps into polls for lots of other reasons. So you can imagine that if there are two sponsors of a poll, they use the exact same vote preference question, but maybe people who lean Republican are more likely to answer the phone when one sponsor is calling versus another sponsor, then that could add bias even if the question's asked in the exact same way.
And to add behind that, we also randomize the order of things within questions. So when we ask the vote choice questions, half of the respondents will get Trump and Pence first, and the other half will get Biden and Harris first, so that there's no issues with ordering in the questionnaire design. Even the question about what's your most important issue, we randomize all the issues we ask about as well.
Okay, another question we have is we talked about this a little bit, but what goes into the weighting system for national election polls? And then do pollsters ever receive criticism for the weighting methodology they choose? I'm sure none of you guys ever get any criticism for the way you've done your job, right? It's open to anyone who wants to take it.
Yeah, I'd be curious how Emily and Mike weight the polls that they've been involved in. I mean, I think there's usually a common set of variables that people choose, like age, gender, race, ethnicity, region, and some others. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is what statistical techniques they'll use. So those are the two main decisions that people have to make when applying a weighting scheme. But yeah, it's difficult. So the way to choose variables is you want to find things that are related to people's vote preference and also people's decision to participate in the survey or not. That is, it should be associated with non-response. And it's really hard finding variables that are correlated with both of those two things. And it changes from year to year, as I think Chris pointed out earlier. Education turned out to be a really important demographic predictor of vote choice in the last election, and it was correlated with non-response. So that's sort of the double whammy. If you omit variables like that, you tend to get bias. And so the key question this time is, are we omitting other variables from weighting schemes that are going to be correlated with who people want to vote for and whether or not they pick up the phone when they're called? And that's an open question.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've gone over a lot about why, what goes into designing this methodology and why you make it the same data set, and then pollsters may reach kind of different results at the end of it. One of the questions we're getting is, about all these different models, but also if you're a journalist, how can you make sure that you're using the poll in the most accurate context? I think, Emily, you said there are some good AP guidelines to help out with this. Chris, do you want to add anything more about how you can make sure you're reporting on this kind of thing accurately?
Yeah, I think just looking at the context of all the other polls that have come before and not taking a poll that has just this one snapshot and giving it too much importance or too little importance. It's one poll in the context of polls. And one of the things that I think we saw in 2016 and we continue to see in 2020 in particular is the lack of swing state polling with the decimation of local newspapers. I mean, as we saw, in 20 years ago, many local papers, major metros, would pay for and do their own polling that was rigorous and that was balanced and fair. And we would be able to put that into the data set. As the local news economy has collapsed, we've seen a lot less of that polling, which also contributes to the difficulty of getting good numbers in those swing states, because it's up to national organizations to come in and do that state-specific polling. You just don't get as much data as you used to, and that's also something to consider when you're covering these polls.
Okay, guys, I think that's pretty much all the time that we have today. You guys have been great. The panelists have been amazing. Very thankful to University of Maryland for letting us do this. I kind of feel like if you take anything away from this, it's that there are a lot of resources. Emily listed a lot of them to help you understand, interpret, to report on polls, that you do need to be kind of intelligent in how you're taking in these polls. Pay attention to what is available as far as the methodology, as far as the margin of error, as far as how the questions are worded and who is putting the poll out there. And then also look at it in the context, as Chris Freitz was just pointing out, the context of other polls, the context of where we are in the election cycle, the context of what else you may learn in any poll other than just the horse race numbers. Thank you to everyone who is participating in this remotely and for your amazing questions. I want to remind you guys, there is more Democracy coming. Identity Politics event is coming on October 20th. That's all we got. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Terrific panel.
Thank you, Dean Ball.